What is the hidden truth behind the shocking wave of defections to the UDA party? You know, this is a very worrying trend to most Kenyans. And indeed, I saw a post recently where somebody said that President William Samoei Ruto is at his most dangerous phase. What does that mean? It means that going forward, Kenyans should expect things to happen in our country that will make Kenyans very, very, very uncomfortable, very sad, and maybe even very terrified. Oh yes! Even if one does not want to believe what this Kenyan was saying in this post, the evidence is staring at us in front of our eyes. Because we have before us defections that do not make sense at all. Because ordinarily, you defect to a party that is strong in your region, which will improve your chances of winning the upcoming general elections. But then what we're seeing happening is people defecting to the most unpopular party, the most unpopular political outfit in the region, therefore guaranteeing their loss at the ballot. That doesn't make sense. Does it make sense to you? What all this means is that President William Samoei Ruto, the party leader of UDA, is doing some things behind the scenes that is causing people to behave in a very strange, bizarre manner. Welcome to my show today, where some of these reasons behind the shocking wave of defections to the ruling UDA will really blow your mind. This is UDA politics, which reminds me very much of the very dirty, brutal, canoe politics. But before we go into those reasons, let us take a moment to look at some of the latest defections that have left Kenyans shocked, confused, puzzled, not understanding what is going on. And to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that this is a trend, definitely a trend, the latest is actually from Western Kenya, where former Kiminini legislator, Bwana Chris Wamalwa, Honorable Chris Wamalwa, I'm sure most Kenyans remember him. He was very vocal in defending the rights of Kenyans. Indeed, at one point, he was my favorite member of parliament. Chris Wamalwa, in the last few hours, has defected from Ford Kenya to join UDA. Okay, we know that Bwana Wamalwa has been having endless squabbles with the Ford Kenya party leader, who is also the Speaker of the National Assembly, Bwana Moses Wetangula. Okay, we know that. And had he defected to ODM or any other opposition political party, it would have made sense. But UDA? You know, even in Western Kenya right now, currently, the UDA party is extremely unpopular, unlikely to have any impact in the forthcoming general elections. And therefore, what Bwana Wamalwa has done, he has just cut his feet. He has made it more difficult, for him to win any elective post. That is exactly what he has done by joining UDA. But there's more. Bwana Wamalwa has also entered the UDA party very enthusiastically, full of energy, because he has announced that he wants the Secretary General seat. He wants to fight for that seat, Secretary General, UDA party. Of course, this seat is currently held by Hassan Omar. In another very interesting development, Naivasha Member of Parliament, Jane Kiara, most of us will be aware that it has recently been reported that she has defected to the UDA party. Well, the Naivasha legislator has come out and told us that that is not the case. Actually, she has been very emphatic in saying that there is nothing like that she is in DCP, Gachagua's party, to stay. Now, analysts cannot help but link this latest announcement by MP Jane Kiara to a recent meeting between Gachagua and her political rival, Jane Kiara's political rival, an aspirant for the Naivasha seat in the forthcoming elections, Bwana Wakili Njoroge. I think she interpreted this latest development into Gachagua looking for a replacement to replace her, because it was widely believed she had already defected back to the UDA party. And so in effect she was coming out to say, no, I'm still here. Jane Kiara has of course been a very vocal supporter of Rigathi Gachagua and the DCP party, constantly firing barbs at President Ruto and the UDA party and the government. The UDA government, of course. Yet another very shocking defection to UDA is that of a very close associate, forefront supporter of Gachagua, the Nyeri governor, Mutahi Kahiga. Now, you know, politicians usually dress the truth in such heavy clothing, so much so that it becomes very difficult to separate the truth from fiction and lies, and outright blatant lies. That is the reality. Because Bwana Kahiga is saying he never left UDA. Ish. In other words, he's saying this is not a defection. This is just a confirmation that he's still in UDA. Seriously? Really? The way this governor has been supporting Gachagua? In fact, it all started at around the time Gachagua was impeached. Mutahi Kahiga was one of the first senior UDA politicians to come out and castigate the move and distance themselves from the move. I'm sure many of us remember that. And after that, he very closely associated himself with Gachagua and DCP, that it was rather obvious which camp he belonged to. Yeah, the Gachagua camp, of course. Anyway, I guess it does not matter whether he has remained in UDA or whether he has defected. The reality is that he is now firmly in UDA and firmly with President William Samoei Ruto. That is the reality of the situation, confirmed by Mutahi Kahiga himself. For now, his language of announcing this is really not relevant. I'm sure you agree. But by far the most painful defection away from Gachagua is that of the Githunguri MP, Gathoni Wa Muchomba. That one was painful. Because this politician had succeeded in positioning herself as a very prominent member of the opposition and also a very, very prominent member of Gachagua's DCP party, the Murema party. Yeah? Now, all of a sudden, out of the blue, she's saying that she has abandoned politics and politicking for development. Really? Really? Is she serious? And so we can see there is something happening here. Obviously, there is something happening behind the scenes. There is an animal, loitering around behind the scenes that is grabbing prominent politicians from the opposition and doing something very strange to them so that they start speaking in a very strange manner and in a very strange language that supporters of these politicians cannot understand. I have decided to abandon politics and politicking. I now want to focus on development for my people. What does that even mean? I believe to start getting important clues as to what is really happening before I go into the information I have received, we need to go back in history to a time in our politics when something exactly like this was unfolding. After the 1992 general elections, where Moi was rigged back into power, it was also the era of the infamous YK92, which included people like President Ruto, who were key in using money to lure politicians away from the opposition, into joining KANU or into supporting the KANU cause, or even into being moles in the opposition for Moi and KANU. And so there, already you have it. One of the chief baits that was used was money. So what else is new in Kenyan politics? That is normal. It is more than instructive that the soft underbelly KANU used to lure prominent politicians from the opposition was money. They looked for broke politicians. And by the way, broke politicians are always a dime a dozen. Wako wengi, for some reason, I don't know what happens to these people when they go into politics. They just spend money like there is no tomorrow. And therefore, they're always in a very precarious financial situation. Okay? But admittedly, at other times, it is after a very fierce fight for parliamentary seat, and sometimes followed by a very expensive petition. Lawyers don't come cheap. And then after a by-election is declared, that particular candidate finds that they're flat broke. Wamemaliza pesa yote. This was exactly the case in a very, very sad story involving a member of parliament called Fred Masinde of the Ford Kenya party, who was in fact elected posthumously. He was already dead as people were casting votes to elect him MP for Mathare. I believe it will be very useful for our purposes today to look at a few specifics about this Frederick Masinde story. 1992 was Kenneth Matiba's election. In fact, most of us analysts believe that he was the real winner of the presidential election in that year. You know, Nairobi parliamentary seats quite often reflect the mood right across the country. It's only that it is confused when somebody goes ahead and rigs the presidential race. And so in 1992, Kenneth Matiba swept Nairobi, including Mathare, where the Ford Asili aspirant, Muriah Macharia, was declared the winner. Now, Frederick Masinde, also in the opposition, Ford Kenya, decided to go to court. And his petition was successful, and a by-election was declared. But there was a problem. Masinde was flat broke. And so was the political party he was vying under, Ford Kenya, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga's Ford Kenya. And so he was stuck. He didn't know what to do. And very predictably, the KANU party came calling. And after some discussions with Dr. Fred Masinde, the man called a press conference and announced at the 11th hour that he was pulling out of the race for the Mathare seat. Now, the rules are such that you cannot pull out at the last minute and then change your ticket and vie on a KANU ticket. That is not possible. And so we must assume that KANU's play here was to get to Masinde's opponent, after he had already pulled out of the race, and turn him. But then drama. Barely a few hours after this first press conference, withdrawing from the Mathare race, Bwana Masinde called another press conference, and this time told Kenyans he was still running for the Mathare seat. Now, today we know what was happening behind the scenes. People like Raila and other opposition figures had spoken to Masinde. You know, it was Jaramogi Oginga Odinga who had convinced him to vie for the Mathare seat, and he had passed on just a few months earlier. And therefore these opposition figures told Masinde, now, what do you think Jaramogi is thinking, wherever he is, In the other world, now that you've pulled out of this race, and you know the way Kenyans fear the dead. Hence Masinde's press conference, rubbishing his earlier press conference, where he had announced that he was pulling out. Okay, now he was back in the race. But there was a major problem. Alikuwa amekula pesa ya KANU, in making his initial decision. Now I've chosen this example, because I want us to take note of some of the tactics that were being used by KANU. Okay? And all this drama was unfolding around the last week to the by-election. And so the day before the by-election, do you know what happened? Dr. Fred Masinde was abducted. And we're told he was tortured. Did he refund the hefty amount of money, KANU money, he had been given? We will never know. But later he was released, and on his way to Mathare, he was living in Woodley, along Gong Road. On his way to Mathare, he had a road accident, in quotes. Very interesting road accident. Because it was a head-on collision, and then another vehicle hit him from behind. By the way, he was not in his vehicle. He was in a taxi. That accident occurred very close to the city mortuary, as we used to call it in those days. And the election took place as Bwana Masinde was in critical condition in hospital. And by the time tallying was going on, he died. But he was elected posthumously as the Member of Parliament for Mathare in that by-election. And I believe this is a very instructive story to answer the question, what are the hidden truths behind the shocking wave of UDA defections or defections to the UDA party? And the answer to that question, anything goes. Abductions, bribery, blackmail, anything. Files can be waived. Any weakness that can be used will be used. You know, there are rumors that one of the characters who has defected to UDA, they have a problem controlling waste activities, activities of the waste section in a human body. They have problems controlling those kind of activities. I'm sure you know what I mean. And it is quite possible that in that instance, blackmail was used. We are going to tell Kenyans what you have been doing. We are going to destroy your character. So either you come back to UDA or character yako, heshima ile Wakenya wanakupatia, kwisha maneno. Something like that is highly likely, very possible. Bottom line, we have entered the season of defections. History is repeating itself. We are back to the post-1992 general elections era. The drama that was unfolding then. The very unfortunate, sad things that happened then. So beware. Brace yourselves, because anything goes. It is very clear that UDA are not joking. They are serious about these defections. And so we should expect some very prominent members of the opposition to suddenly start talking a strange language we do not understand, and to suddenly defect back to the ruling UDA party in moves that will not make any political sense, but may make sense cash-wise, cash money, and in other ways, some of which I've mentioned. Very sad, but that is the reality. Now, very quickly before I go, as we wind up my latest offer, that is the highly sensitive video on what happened to Cyrus Njirongo. Today, I'm also throwing in the video on what happened to Baba, Raila Amolo Odinga. Now, at the time I produced this special report, there were so many Kenyans who were saying to themselves, Chris doesn't know what he's talking about. Ati Baba was assassinated? No, hiyo ni story ya jaba. However, fortunately, Like many reports we produce on this channel, that particular highly sensitive special report has stood the test of time. Okay? And I'm grateful and I'm humbled. Now today, as we wind up this special offer, I'm throwing in that sensitive report on what exactly happened to Baba. Very fascinating. So you're going to get that, as well as the video on what happened to Njirongo, and the ebook on what happened to Njirongo. And the price remains the same. Only Kenya shillings $14.99. You can see all the details on your screens right now. Just M-Pesa $14.99 to the usual number, and you'll have this valuable, super fascinating information. Until next time, this is Chris Karaoke Kumekucha.